each and every one of you for taking time out of your day to come just join us. And giving me an opportunity to talk to you in the chamber and I guess some other guests that are here as well about what's going on. Give you a little quick legislative update on what's happening in Washington, and then really reserve balance of time for questions about what's happening and what's keeping you all up at night, because I think that's critically important for what's going on right now. So in Washington, I think the biggest thing that we're facing right now, obviously from a nuts and bolts perspective, some of the legislation that's going on right now. We just passed the Jobs Act. The President just signed that into law on Thursday. I was actually out in Washington for the Stock Act signing the day before. So a couple of pieces of legislation that were passed more recently. Happy to see that a couple of those pieces of legislation did move forward because when we look at the Jobs Act was really about 4 or 5 pieces of legislation that had passed the House before by well over 400 votes each. So we hear a lot about the gridlock that's going on in Washington, D.C., and there is a fair amount of gridlock, but some of the things that were frustrating for me coming from the private sector, I'm a small business owner. I employ about 100 people. So for me, that's 100 families, so I take very seriously. But when we're looking at access to capital for job creators, that was part of the Jobs Act. That was really part of the main thrust of it. Those pieces of legislation had passed the House by 400 votes, and they went over to the Senate and sat. And they sat, and they sat, and they sat. And so we've got over 30 jobs bills that have actually passed the House of Representatives that are over in the United States Senate right now waiting. They repackaged, the House of Representatives repackaged about 5 of those bipartisan bills, put them together in what they call the Jobs Act, Jumpstart Our Business Startups, and that's what just passed. The other big pieces of legislation that are being debated and talked about right now is obviously the Surface Transportation Bill. So that's going to be something that is going to impact each and every one of us here in our communities. Certainly when we think about commerce, how it moves in and around, how we move not only people but goods and services around. Obviously the transportation bill is something that I think is vitally important. We haven't had a surface transportation bill since 2005. So one of the other things that we're battling up is, again, this idea of uncertainty. How do we provide more certainty out there is, I think, by having a longer term bills that people can focus in on and say, okay, I know what the funding is going to be. One of the things that certainly I battled against was the idea that we were going to decouple mass transit funding from the Highway Trust Fund. For me, I thought that was absolutely disastrous because certainly we know in the greater Chicago area, mass transit is absolutely critical for us. We're going to actually add another 50% onto our roadways if we were not to have mass transit. So mass transit is going to be absolutely critical for us. That was able to be recoupled. At least any of the new bills that were going forward all talked about recoupling mass transit funding in there. The Senate has passed a 2-year version. The House had a 5-year version, has a 5-year version. The difficulty that I have with the transportation bill as it stands right now is the idea that we're going to be losing in the greater Chicago area and in Illinois altogether about $650 million over the course of the next several years. We're already a donor state. Come on in, we'll get spots up over here. So we're a donor state right now, and to lose $650 million I think would be certainly sending us in the wrong direction. So that's going to be the other piece of legislation that's happening right now. Unfortunately for all of us, right now, everything's being funneled through the political lens of Washington. And so therefore, what we're going to see is that the only thing that will pass for the next 7+ months is going to be must-pass legislation, which is frustrating. Because I think, as I told you before, coming from the private sector, I'm looking to have the government work, have it operate. We just went through budget season for the House side. How many of you operate on a budget? Everybody operates on a budget. Households, your businesses operate on a budget. Certainly, most communities and municipalities operate on a budget. You should expect that the federal government does the same. We haven't passed a budget in the United States Senate. The Senate hasn't passed a budget in just about 3 years. The House passed its budget just last week. We went through what is a series of budgets that were out there, a number of different proposals. There was actually, for the first time in about 10 years, a bipartisan budget proposal that was put forth. That only got about 38 votes. So unfortunately, that did not pass either, but what we did pass is talking about trying to put some more fiscal discipline in place, which I think is important. And if we take a look back over the last however many years, we've been overspending in Washington, D.C. by a long shot. Republicans have overspent, Democrats have overspent. Washington has a spending problem. And unless we try to correct that spending problem, we're going to find ourselves under a mountain of debt that our children and grandchildren will not know how to get out from underneath. That is really one of the big problems that we face today. So those are the things that we have to tackle. The good news, I think, is that when we look at jobs and the economy, that's the #1 issue that we face in the country. When I ask my colleagues on the other side of the aisle what's the biggest issue we face, they also tell me it's jobs and the economy. And so there is, I believe, some common ground that we realize that this is the #1 issue that we've got to get our arms around. This is the one thing that we've got to deal with. And so what I've been trying to focus in on is, again, what are the areas of common ground that we have? Because Washington's fairly polarized right now. But I think the American public is pretty well fed up with the gridlock, the bickering that's going on. What are the areas of agreement? And I think if we can focus on those areas of agreement, we're going to be able to try to move some legislation that I hope will be beneficial for the country. Certainly, I know Sandy knows as well in terms of what's going on in Springfield. We've got certainly some issues down there. But I think what we can do in terms of the overall picture is to create an environment, not only here through Springfield's work, but also in the country, to try to create an environment that better enables small businesses all across the country to have the confidence to invest back in their businesses and to grow. We have 29 million small businesses in our country, okay, like many of you around the table that operate and work with small businesses. If we can create an environment where half of those businesses can create a single job, think about where we'd be then. That's really what the message needs to be. That's what we need to be focusing in, not only in Springfield, but in Washington as well. So we've got obviously a significant amount of issues that we're going to be dealing with in the coming months. Obviously, the focus is going to be all put through the political lens as we're in a presidential election year. So what I'd like to do, if I can, with your permission, is to open it up to questions and go from there. We can talk, if you want, about the deficit. And we've been on a deficit spending for a long time. This last year we spent about $1.5 trillion in deficit spending, which most people, when I ask them what does it mean, what does $1.5 trillion mean to you? Most people just say, let's go to the credit union. $1.5 trillion. What's the credit union going to do for us on $1.5 trillion? $1.5 trillion works out to be about $3.4 million a minute in deficit spending. So how much money have we spent today that we don't have, even since you walked through the doors of the Civic Center? Just think about that. It's pretty significant. So these are some of the big issues that we're trying to tackle that are in front of us right now. So let's open it up to questions.
I do have a question.
For
years, all the time there was always talk about inflation. All once, you never hear a word about it. What's happened to that? Because you go out, you buy gas, you buy food, everything's sky high. I don't know how young families make it. But you never hear in the news anybody talk about inflation anymore.
Well, and it's because we've kept inflation low. Inflation's been kept low. The Federal Reserve has had an opportunity to try to really keep those rates low. And so that's why you haven't heard a whole lot about it. Now, having said that, that's why things like Social Security, they did not have those increases because they did it on inflation. Right? So they said, well, we didn't have a rise in inflation, so therefore we're not going to have an increase. But as you pointed out aptly, Bob, we've got fuel prices that are continuing to be on the rise. We've got food prices that are certainly on the rise, and they're impacting people's lives each and every day. So these are part of the problems that we've got to try to tackle. So although they say inflation's not going up, and we have seen inflation go up a little bit, not a ton, a little bit, but we're seeing prices that are impacting family budgets each and every day going up. And so people are are making choices about what they can and can't buy. And so budgets are getting tightened, obviously, in dealing with the Round Lake area, Round Lake Beach, Round Lake Heights. Issues in talking with some of the elected officials are very similar. They've got, certainly there's foreclosure issues that are impacting us, which is enormous. That's an enormous issue as we talk about what do municipalities then do with these properties that are now vacant, if they are vacant, or going through the process of people trying to hang on to their homes. And certainly the federal government's got a role in that. I sit on the Financial Services Committee, and so we deal oftentimes with, what do we do with the regulators? What signals are they sending? And part of it is that we can't, the regulators oftentimes are sending the signal, we can't help you until you've been delinquent on your mortgage payment for 3 months. Well, that's the last thing we want to do, from my perspective, is make someone delinquent on their mortgage payment before we can jump in to try to help them. Right? There's nothing inherently wrong about that.
Mm-hmm.
So, because people are trying to do the right things. They're trying to make sure that they are paying their bills and doing the right thing, and they're looking for some sort of relief. So there's some big issues that we're trying to face there. Yes, sir.
Other than the election in November, what can anything be done about the energy costs and essentially the moratorium on drilling and really this current administration's hatred towards energy?
I think there is something that has to be done with regard to energy. And one it is that we've got to make sure we've got a succinct energy policy that weans our dependence from foreign oil. I think we've got to become more energy independent. And one of the things that I've said all along, for a long period of time, is the idea that I think that there's 4 things that we can and should be doing. First of all, I think we ought to be giving a green light to renewable energies, in that innovation that's coming down from different entrepreneurs that are saying, what's the new way of getting renewable energy, whether it be wind, biothermal, you name it. We want to make sure that geothermal, wind, solar, whatever it may be, give them the green light to continue to innovate. Second thing I would say is we want to make sure that we're talking about giving the green light to those rigs that are sitting down in the Gulf and other places right now. They're being slow walked right now from the Department of the Interior. Say, give them a thumbs up or thumbs down on getting those leases back and operational. Because again, they're losing millions of dollars a day sitting idle. And they're going to leave, and they're taking off and they're going over at about 3 miles an hour across the Atlantic, never to return. And yet what we do know, we know that China's pumping oil off the coast of Cuba. Right? So they're coming into the same areas that we're talking about right now. So I do think we need to give a thumbs up or thumbs down with regard to drilling. So if there's a bad actor, we tell them no, you're not able to get the oil lease, but if they're okay, then we should be getting them back and operational as quickly as possible. Other thing I would say is that we're going into the season right now where we've got fuel monopolies. There's 17 different fuel monopolies throughout the country and dealing with the fuel blends. And we operate on the Shineman blend here in the greater Chicago area. Okay. Why do we have 17 different blends? Why not have the best blend? Okay, let's make sure we've got a mass production of it. And therefore, when we're talking about the blends, we just say that there's an ample quantity. Because if we were to have an issue at one of our refineries that deals with the Shineman blend, we'd see fuel prices skyrocket well over $6 a gallon overnight. And this is something that obviously is important to many of our businesses and the like that move goods and services around. It's absolutely critical for us. So I think we need to deal with the fuel blends. The other thing that we need to deal with, lastly on the 4th point on this one, and then we'll go back to whatever we want, is
If I can hold the thought.
is the idea of natural gas. We've got trillions of cubic feet of natural gas here in Illinois alone, in the New Albany Shale Reserve. And yet we see it all across the country where we've got really unbelievable opportunity to try to tap into a natural gas here in the United States that could be a tremendous source of energy for us. And if we take a look at what's going on in places like North Dakota and others, they're seeing, obviously their unemployment rate is way down, it's about 3%, and you can't even get a hotel in certain areas. So we've got to do it in an environmentally friendly manner, but we do have to tap into what I think is an incredible source of energy. So, now, all right.
On the 17 different ones throughout the country, is that part of what's responsible for the regional differences in pricing?
Yes, that's some of it, and then there's...
So if we went with a more economical blend in our area, we could help reduce fuel prices for everyone?
We actually have one of the most expensive blends across the whole country.
We have a very expensive blend. We also have probably the 3rd most expensive area for fuel in the country, which is obviously has a huge and enormous impact in terms of just our costs of daily life, in terms of moving goods and services around.
Who has the magic wand that dictates the blend?
Well, I think that's, I don't know who has the magic wand in terms of saying we want to move to one blend. But certainly it's going to be federal regulators that will be able to, say what blends are which.
So EPA is who we would have
The
to.
EPA would certainly, I think, be a big factor in that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yes, obviously debt is the number one problem is that debt. And, for years, we've been paying subsidies for Amtrak because they can't make a go on their own. Now we're building high-speed rail that we know will never be able to pay its own way. I mean, the rail line from Chicago to Springfield to St. Louis will never support itself. Why are we doing this?
Why are we doing high-speed rail? Is that your question?
Yeah, because we know it's going to cost us every year to pay it off. It's not going to support itself.
Well, I think that what we've got to talk about in terms of the overall is the transportation infrastructure in general, right? Because that's a huge issue with regard to our roads, our bridges, the rail itself. And we know, certainly in this area, how much we rely upon it. We rely upon it pretty significantly. And we think about, I can move a rail car from California to Chicago in 2 days. It takes another 2 days to get from one side of Chicago to the other side of Chicago. And then it can go on and move further things. In terms of trying to deal with our rail and try to deal with some of the other infrastructure, so critical to our economy. It's absolutely vital to our economy that we're able to do this and put those improvements in. So certainly when we talk about the high-speed rail, I know it's one of the things that's important to a lot of people. I'd like to say that we're investing in the infrastructure so that we're being able to move those goods and services better as opposed to simply, because right now the big high-speed rail push is between Chicago and St. Louis.
But isn't that primarily a commuter line?
That would be, that is a different thing. That would be primarily a commuter line.
That's what I'm about. That's never going to support itself, a commuter line.
My point is that I think we've got other priorities
Yeah.
that we need to be able to focus those dollars in infrastructure
Yes.
that would be able to help us out in a better way, shape, and form. Yeah.
Is it not the thought about high-speed rail between Chicago and St. Louis is to give people an alternative to god-awful air travel? I think isn't that part of the thing?
Well, that would certainly be one thing, no question. The difficulty is what is the real traffic between St. Louis and Chicago? I think even if you take a look at the air travel, it's not that significant. So there's really one area in terms of the rail today, if you look at Amtrak, that's been profitable, and it's really just one line, and that's really it's the northeast corridor between Washington, D.C. and Boston. It goes up through New York. That's the one area that's been profitable. But in many instances, if we look at it's kind of like our roadways, right? Why is Illinois a donor state? Because we've got to be able to make sure that there are an interstate roadway system in places that can't support it further west through Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota, some of these other areas. We want to make sure that we're getting our resources back, putting to use here, where the vast majority of the population is. But that's why you're going to see some of that inequities there so that we can have the ability to travel and move goods and services around.
Did you sign on with Congressman Lipinski to his bill and effort to put in cut down the transit time in Chicago? I think there was some flyovers and rail yards to the south of Chicago that he was interested in funding in a partnership to avoid
Is that part of the CREATE? I know that was CREATE was part of another issue.
yeah.
And that was part of the thing that was really being hampered in the new surface transportation bill that was proposed on the House floor. That did not pass and hasn't really been moved forward. So part of those regional projects, which I think are going to be absolutely important for us, have to be addressed there as well. So Congressman Lipinski and I have voiced our opposition to, when it first came out, the transportation bill, and it was in its current form. They've made some changes on that. We're going to see what actually gets brought up back again. I do think and have heard from a number of folks that they are interested in trying to, whether it be road builders, Metro, PACE, and the rest, they're looking for some more certainty to come in place as opposed to funding things on a 6-month or 3-month, as we've just passed a 3-month extension.
Yeah, but the transportation bill since Eisenhower was president, we miss him, it's been a 4-year term, and they renew it. what's the problem now with it? I mean, transportation is, everybody has their pet projects.
Sure.
Obama seems to like high-speed rail. He thinks he's in Europe. He isn't. But transportation is a good thing, it seems
Sure.
to me.
Transportation.
And I have to disclose, I do own stock in railroads.
You don't have to disclose that. Transportation is a good thing, and it should be and inherently is a bipartisan thing.
Right.
Because everybody uses the roads, right? I mean, everybody uses the roads. Everybody uses goods and services that use the roads, the bridges, the railways, and the like. What I will say with regard to what's different about this bill than we've had before. Last time we had a bill, again, was 2005. What's different about this bill is the idea that there are no earmarks. First time we haven't had earmarks in a bill. So take out 6,300 earmarks, 6,300 earmarks out of a bill. We're talking about a clean piece of legislation, talking about policy driven. Was also trying to shorten, one of the good things that is part of this bill is they're trying to shorten the time frame that you're able to get a project done from what right now is about 15 years to get a road or a bridge done, down to about 7 or 8. That's a real positive. You're gonna have some real cost savings there as well, because what you're doing is you're running things through concurrently, because there's a lot of different steps that people have to take in order to get that authorization and approval to move forward. So the idea that they're running through those processes concurrently to shorten that time frame is all good news, because you'd be talking about saving a significant amount of resources. So that would be a good portion of the bill. But what you have is you have all of a sudden now a difference in how the bill is getting done and passed. And so part of it is that they're cutting back on it. And part of my concern was, again, we're looking at other ways to try to fund it. But we're talking about cutting $648 million out of the Illinois budget right now in order to try to fund it, which, again, I think is, as a donor state, we're putting more dollars into it, and it's from a greater metropolitan area. We put about, if you take metropolitan areas around the country, about 84% of the motor fuel tax comes from the urban areas, and only 48% gets funded back through those areas. So, again, my thing is that not that we don't need to tighten our belt, but we don't want to be taking such a huge hit when our infrastructure around here needs some help. Yeah,
I can change the subject.
fire away.
Would you talk a little bit about the plan for the next 4 years to deal with undocumented immigrants and the Green Act? Thoughts about it?
Sure. Well, I think when we look at, and the first part of your question was on the,
Comprehensive immigration reform,
Comprehensive.
undocumented immigrants.
I think if you take a look at comprehensive immigration reform, I think comprehensive immigration reform is going to be difficult because you're trying to cast such a wide net. What I think you would be better off doing is trying to talk about cutting it into smaller segments and passing those. Because you can get a lot of people on board for a good chunk of it, but once you take that next thing for comprehensive, then everybody goes their own different directions. So I think if you talk about cutting it down in pieces, you have a much better chance of actually moving something forward. The DREAM Act, for instance, is something that I said, look, I think the DREAM Act goes in the right direction. I would change it somewhat. So if you want to serve your country, or you want to then serve the country in terms of AmeriCorps or something else like that, not for 2 years, but for 3 years, something along those lines, we need to be able to give you the opportunity for permanent residency here in the United States, so that we're not preventing you from being able to move forward with your life here in the U.S. So again, I think a step forward in the right direction. I do think as a national security issue, we've got to be talking about protecting our borders. We have to know who's coming into the country and who's not, right? And who's going out. We need to make sure that that is something that we do take a good handle on. But we want to make sure that we're not hurting folks that are trying to do the right things. We want to give back to our community and our country. Fire away. Good to see you. How you been?
Pretty good.
Good.
I've got a little different aspect than Bob. I see everything going deflationary right now. I don't think you could spend enough to cause inflation, personally. Our total market credit debt is at 52 trillion, something around that range, and it's the same place it was when it started. The crisis started 4 years ago. So the market exposure for the lenders is still huge. 15 trillion of that, I think, is 15 to 17 is government has, federal government. Housing prices are going down. I can now hire employees less than I could 4 years ago. every credit line I've got with every business, every supplier is being cut monthly. All those things are deflationary for me. We have, most businesses like myself, we don't have discretionary spending anymore because our lines of credit are being eliminated or cut.
Yep.
Is there any type of legislation out there that would ease up the lending to businesses, small businesses right now?
That's a great question, and one of the things that we hear all the time in terms of access to capital, which I know as a small business owner, and you know as well, is the lifeblood of most of our businesses. If we can't get access to capital, it's going to be a pretty significant problem. And one of the things, you can talk about the Small Business Administration. Certainly the Small Business Administration is great if you're able to jump through the hoops to be able to get that paperwork. Right now, through Dodd-Frank, which is one of the things that we view on a fairly regular basis, they're putting almost a one-size-fits-all mentality upon most financial institutions. I talked to a lot of financial institutions, a lot of local ones. I talked to one the other day that said, Bob, we're not hiring. I said, okay, well, that's not good. And then he corrected himself. He says, no, we are actually hiring. We hired 5 people, all in compliance. And they're in there literally to cross the T's and dot the I's to make sure that the new regulations that have been put in place, they're being compliant with. Some of these smaller financial institutions don't have the ability to add the number of manpower and bodies to be able to do the compliance. And therefore, they're going to be up against the wall. A lot of small businesses get their resources from community banks, credit unions, and others. We need to be able to give them more flexibility. When we think about loans that are going on right now, think about performing mortgages. Performing mortgages right now, the banks are asked to go out and reappraise each and every one. Right? Because the loan to value now is different, because we know prices have gone down. We see it happen all over our communities. And yet, this is a performing mortgage. So if you're a business, this is part of your business plan. You know that this is how much you've got to pay. And had an instance the other day, physician practice. Bank went to him and said, listen, you're going to need to come up with an additional $1 million in principal. Otherwise, we're going to have to foreclose on the business. It was a brand new facility. They weren't late, not once, on their mortgage payment. But because the value of the property and the building had gone down, they now were upside down on their loan to value. Thank goodness they were able to go to their partners and say, and gather the $1 million, but generally you go to the banks and say, I'm supposed to come to you for money, you're not supposed to come to me for money. And so that's part of the issue and the difficulty that we're facing today. We're seeing a lot more of this, and a lot more businesses are going through saying, my line of credit's just been cut, because the regulators are forcing them to do so. Yeah?
Well, yeah, the same thing happened to my business. I used to have probably $500,000 I could borrow at any given time. Well, a lot of those lines of credit just were eliminated.
Mm-hmm.
So my loan to credit value on my personal and business, corporate, went the other way. Where instead of having a bunch of credit available, I now have no, barely any credit available. So my debt is up higher.
Yeah.
So all the banks see that, the credit agencies see
down.
that, my credit score goes down.
Yeah.
Line of credit gets eliminated. Every account I have goes down. I don't know if that's caused by, Dodd-Frank is causing that, or if that's just the nature of where we're at.
We're seeing a lot of regulators that are going through, and they claim their hands are tied, and they are. I mean, they're giving instructions in terms of what they want banks to do, and financial institutions. One of the things that we're dealing with also is you deal with stuff like the SIFI designations, because too big to fail. And so they're going out saying what businesses are too big to fail and what are not. And it's interesting to me. We go through, and I went through and actually talked to Secretary Geithner when he came before the committee, and I asked him, what about a company big company, that's actually filed for bankruptcy? It's gone through the Chapter 11 process and reorganization. Wouldn't they, by just sheer definition, not fit the too big to fail definition that you're putting forth? They hadn't really declared that yet, but that's the kind of stuff that we're dealing with in terms of the regulators.
Are we coming to a point where there's going to be a too big to bail bill?
Thank you for there.
The thing I find interesting about that, though, is that the the regulations and things that are impacting small businesses, when you mentioned 29 million small businesses, together, we got to be bigger than practically any of the biggest companies. And yet we're not seeing enough in terms of things to improve the situation for small business to treat us as a large enterprise. It's collectively, we really are.
Well,
And things that impact Tom's business, my business, collectively, it's one huge hit against the economy.
we see what's going on here in Illinois, right? Let's just rewind. We saw a tax increase on individuals by 66%, on businesses 48% overnight. And almost the next day, you know, the open for business signs went up along the border in Wisconsin. Indiana was saying, by all means, this is great. Chris Christie was running radio ads saying, if you're thinking about leaving Illinois, we'd like you to consider New Jersey. It was interesting, but what we also found was you know, businesses like Caterpillar saying, you know what, we don't have to be in Peoria, we can pick up and leave. Motorola got $100 million over 10 years. Well, let me just ask you a question. If you're sitting on the board of directors of a Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 company in Illinois, and you just got word that Motorola got $100 million over 10 years, how fast would it take you to pick up the phone and call the CEO? Have you made the call to the governor yet? What did we find? Caterpillar, Motorola, Sears Holdings, CME. Right, these are all companies that say, hey, listen, we don't have to be in Illinois. We'd like them to be in Illinois. We're delighted that they're staying. The problem is that businesses like yours and mine, the small businesses that are out there, the 29 million small businesses, obviously they're not all in Illinois, but those small businesses in Illinois, they pick up the phone and call the governor. Trust me, they're not going to get a call back. They're not going to get that tax break, in which case what you're finding is that crony capitalism. Right? We do not want to have crony capitalism. And in fact, part of the budget that was just recently passed talked about trying to eliminate some of that underbrush so that you're not talking about corporate welfare. You're ending that. You're trying to eliminate some of the lobbyist loopholes, lower the rate so that we can be more competitive in the global marketplace. Does anybody question that today the world is flatter than it's ever been? That we're competing with Singapore and Europe and China and every place else? You have to recognize that we live in one of the largest manufacturing districts in the country, right here. We're talking about trying to sell goods and services all over the world. We want to make sure we've got a level playing field. We want to make sure that we're as competitive as we can possibly be. That's the things that we need to do. We cannot continue to have, you know, crony capitalism that's going on.
You were talking about monopolies earlier, last time, and you take the too big to fail in the banking industry. We have, the top 4 banks in the country control over 80% of the banking industry now. Since when did, when you want good regulation, I thought the government would come in and break those up to kind of rebuild, kind of like I always like to look at the Montebello situation in the 80s. Montebello situation in the 80s, they broke them, they're too big. Why isn't it happening anymore?
Well, I think it still is going to happen out there. You have obviously people that are looking at antitrust and how big things are. I think one of the side effects that you have from certainly this excessive regulation out there is that a lot of the small private or smaller community banks can't comply. And what they want to do, they want to comply. We need regulations, right? We're not talking about an environment where there's no regulations. We want them to be smart regulations as opposed to simply more of them. Federal Registry, which houses all the regulations in the country, grew it in 2011 by 13 feet. We don't even measure the pages anymore. So when you're talking about growing something by 13 feet, I mean, are you getting rid of the bad stuff, or are you just adding on top of it, where it's layering more and more on top of it? What this means for most small businesses, certainly for financial institutions and banks, is the idea that, you know, you go to some of the bigger banks, some of those 4 big ones, they've got floors of attorneys, compliance officers dealing with what's going on. Small banks don't have that opportunity. Yes,
Just
sir.
an observation. how many people in Washington realize that all those regulations and the need to manage them, that doesn't add to the GDP?
I'm not sure anybody's got a real handle on what it totally is. It's significant, that, no question, but I would say very few.
Because you mentioned the business owner that hired 5 people to handle compliance.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not manufacturing or making products or anything else, it's just
Yeah,
added
not a
to the
single one of
cost.
them is adding to the bottom line of the bank or going out and seek a new business or doing anything along those lines. Exactly right.
Bob, why don't you talk about STEM education, some of the stuff going on at Wheeling High School?
Sure. I mean, education is something that I think is certainly critically important for our businesses. I know when I talk to a lot of businesses, they say one of the problems they've got is trying to find, quality people that are able to actually take the jobs that they've got available. And one of the things that's been certainly a driver for me is STEM education. So science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. The head of my educational advisory board is a gentleman by the name of Blas Lopez, who is the principal of Wheeling High School. And that is, I think, about 38% ELL, maybe a little bit 43 or 44% reduced or free lunch type of a community. When he came to the school and said he wanted to make Wheeling High School a STEM school, the other teachers thought he was crazy. What are you thinking? But literally by will and determination, he said, no, we will make this a STEM school. And so every senior that actually graduates from Wheeling High School, whether it be, they can get a certificate, tool and die casting, architectural design, pre-nursing care, graphic design, whatever it may be that gives them an opportunity and an edge, whether it be getting a summer job or whether it be deciding to go on to school or into the workforce, which I think is fantastic. They now have been recognized as one of the top 6 STEM schools in the country. And so part of that, though, is working together with the community. One of the things that we've got here at our disposal is College Lake County, which has been absolutely super at trying to reach out into the community and say, if there's a need, we want to fill that need. And on April 11th, we're going to get together with manufacturers, because a lot of the manufacturers are saying, we've got jobs that are open and available. We can't find people qualified to take them. We want to make sure that we're getting them talking to each other and bridging that gap. Because it's going to be absolutely critical and vital to our economy and to our jobs to make sure that we've got students that are well-educated and well-versed in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And a bigger push has got to be on towards younger women into this because, for instance, engineering, 18% of the graduates are women in engineering. And then actually in the workforce, it's only about 12%. So a real opportunity there to try to make sure that we're getting people educated and prepared to take jobs in the 21st century. So it's going to be the building blocks for everything that we're going to do.
I've noticed in my work that a lot of these people under 30, or maybe more over 30, I don't know, they can't spell correctly. They can't write a coherent sentence. They know nothing about American history, so they will be condemned an entire generation to repeating the mistakes of the past. I mean, the Congress repealed Glass-Steagall in 1999 because the bankers wanted it. What's Glass-Steagall? Well, it kept the investment side of banking from the deposit side. They repealed that, and in 10 years, we have the problems we have now. 32-page bill versus Dodd-Frank. And the other thing they know nothing about is finances. They don't know how to write a check. They don't know how to balance a checkbook because all those courses have vanished from high school. They use their debit cards and they think they're very proud of that when they tell me that. And I look at their financial statements and they're paying $125 a month in overdraft charges because they didn't think to get overdraft protection, or they can't. It's all automatic, it's electronic.
Sure.
So they don't balance their checkbooks. So, I mean, you can do engineering and math and science, but if you can't write it and describe it to somebody else, and if you misspell words, people of my generation anyway take you as poorly educated. So I think the emphasis should be back on history and grammar, and at least a course in finances. The Navy has a 3-day course at Great Lakes on finances, and Navy Federal Credit Union comes in and talks to them and signs them up for debit cards. But those are, I mean, if we have financial problems in the country now, I think it's going to get worse if people can't keep track of their own money. And to them, it's all electronic money now. It's not real. It's like tax money. It's not real money. It's tax money. So we can spend it any way we want. So my point merely is those 3 areas need to be emphasized in a good quality high school education. Otherwise, you know, I think you're behind the power curve. You may be improving science and math and what have you, but you're not improving in other areas. As a matter of fact, you're probably going downhill in other areas. So I would advocate more history. Being a history major.
I couldn't tell.
Following up on that, and if you watched the Masters over the weekend, ExxonMobil had an ad that ran multiple times showing the United States is 25th in the world as far as educating our children. And we spend more and more and more money every year, and the results are going down, down, down. You know, Bush had the No Child Left Behind, which wasn't perfect, but at least we were trying. Now Obama's throwing that out, takes the guy from the worst school system in the entire United States in Chicago, puts him in charge of education. What are they going to do in Washington to make education more important and do a better job in this country?
I think your point is a good one. When we take, No Child Left Behind, or what is now going on right now is the reauthorization of the ESEA, No Child Left Behind. No Child Left Behind, the real positive of No Child Left Behind was the idea that every single group, every single demographic in the school system was going to be, they were going to shine a light on them and nobody was going to be able to be forgotten. That's the real positive. The negative of it, which I think far outshadows the others, is the idea that we're talking about a test. We're teaching to a test, and we're talking about a snapshot in time, as opposed to real growth model assessments. So, in essence, I can tell you just from my own experience with my own children, that if we were going to test my daughter in the 4th grade, she goes on, and then my son comes through and gets tested in the 4th grade, same teacher, they're going to have vastly different scores. Teacher's not gotten worse. We're just talking about different students. Now, what would be beneficial is take a student, test that student, and see how they progress through the year, and we're going to see real teaching happen there. What we want to make sure is that we want to make sure there's accountability. I've yet to find anybody that's afraid of accountability. They just want to have a seat at the table to determine how they're going to be held accountable and determine how to do that. We do know that the reauthorization of ESEA, No Child Left Behind, in terms of the annual yearly progress, is going to eventually very quickly have all schools not meeting AYP. Okay? All schools. So pick your best school, pick your best public high school in the region, and they will not be making AYP very shortly. Okay? This is sending the wrong signals. So I think the things that we've got to be able to do is we've got to talk about those growth model assessments. We've got to be able to make sure that we're enabling and holding people accountable as well, because they've got to run hand in hand. So obviously, some of the areas that we're dealing with, we've got some issues in some school systems that are over in North Chicago right now, and obviously that's one that we're very concerned with, in that region, obviously surrounding the Navy base there. But there's educational institutions all around the district that need help. We know we've had some right here that have had the state come in and help out and get out of some trouble and then hand it back over.
We talk about testing for education. In Illinois, they have the ISAT exam, and they're going to come with a national test now. They're going to do away with it, from my understanding. How do you feel? How do you think that's going to help? Where you equalize across the country this testing, or is it going to benefit, or is it going to, or where do you stand on that?
Well, I don't know what it's going to do in terms of the national test. What I can tell you is that obviously I'm more of a proponent of local control. I want to make sure that the local area has a much greater control over what's being taught, what's happening. not to say that we've got to have a national, in terms of we want these things to be done, so that anybody who graduates from high school has these basic understanding of certain topics and knowledge of certain classes. That's certainly one of the things that I think can be important and is important. But we want to be focusing more on local control where all possible.
And then going to higher education, we're hearing more and more students are coming out of college at the university level where now they're not being able to pay for their loans. What, and then the federal government's taken over the whole loan program. How is that going to affect the taxpayer in the long run, because we're seeing more and more people going to default there?
Well, we're seeing more and more people that need loans, right? So I can just tell you, in talking to some educational institutions, 2/3 of all the students get some sort of aid or grant. It would seem to me that maybe the cost of the schools is too high if we're talking about needing aid or grant for 2/3 of the students. And the idea is that we've seen education in general, outpace inflation significantly. University of Illinois, for instance, one of the higher state funding schools in terms of what it costs to actually go there. So we've got to be able to talk about, being able to tighten our belt and make sure we're keeping costs down, because the costs are far outpaced inflation and it becomes problematic for students. So I can't even imagine most students are going to have to come out with a significant amount of student loans.
And then this is a personal issue I have. My wife just graduated. She got a higher degree in education and a master's, and we found out now that the government has taken over, we cannot refinance it to a lower rate. Great credit, we're fine there, but I feel that we're not the only ones alone in this, and if we're paying like 8%, we had to pay starting this year, December. And we went to go to the bank to refi it, and they said, we can't do this a federal loan, back loan. And that to me is
Was it
serious.
refinance as a federal loan?
We wanted to refi it so we...
No, but did you refinance it once already?
No.
No?
It's her new loan, it came to, we had to start paying on it, and they won't let us go to a lower rate. And you look at housing rates, it's cheaper to buy a house than it is to get a higher education, degree.
Yeah.
And she spoke to the people at Fed Ed and all that, and so I find to me it's a serious issue, because if you can't finance it, to me it sounds like someone's trying just to make money for the people that can pay and afford it.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe we should default for 3 months.
But they will give us a 0.2 or a 0.08% decrease if we do electronic withdrawal, which we already had it set up. So since it was already set up, they wouldn't even give us that.
We'll talk to you later and we'll make sure we take a look at what's going on there. Yes, sir.
On the education issue, I was reading an article the other day where they said the loan rates to students have increased over 800% in the last two years, I think it was. When there's not a lot of jobs available, whose idea was that?
Not mine. That's all I can tell you. It's not mine. I don't know whose idea it was. Or what was going on with that.
Well, first of all, welcome back to Molly Beach, Congressman.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Internet sales, as we all know, have been growing every year. And when they first came out, they didn't want to put the local tax on them or sales tax on them because they wanted them to be able to grow unfettered. Well, that's kind of happened. I think we all see more and more people go out there shopping on the internet.
Yep.
They're still not paying the sales tax. The Marketplace Fairness Act, I think, was introduced in the Senate. I'm not sure if it's been in the House yet. I talked to Senator Durbin about it, talked to Senator Tripp's office about it. They're both in support of it. Just want to see where it's going to sit in the House of Representatives. Is there anything wrong with the act that needs to be changed before it be in the House?
I have not seen, I've not read through the entire legislation in theory in general, because right now, internet sales, you're still supposed to pay sales tax on it. Right?
I'm sure everyone in this room does it, right?
Everybody
Your
here,
tax statement.
on your tax returns, you're still supposed to pay that tax. Most people unfortunately don't, because they either lose track of it or just feel that it's not part of the system. I'm sure most people don't even realize they're supposed to. So what this is in essence doing is it's trying to level the playing field for the internet merchant and the retail merchant that's here in the community. And so the idea of steering people to the local merchants, we want to make sure we're steering the local merchants, but the idea of collecting that sales tax for communities such as yours would be a big thing.
Yes.
Because it would go to the person that walks into, and we see this, we've all seen this happen. You go into Best Buy, or you go into some other local store, and you're looking at your camera, you say, oh, touch and feel this one, it looks like a good one, and then I've heard the guys tell them they go back on their smartphone and press buy. They purchase the camera from Best Buy, or some other spot online, Walmart or whatever it may be, and it gets shipped to their home. And yet the local merchant that was there with the inventory in stock, with the manpower there to talk to them about the issue they have with their phone, or in essence, they get nothing for it. Obviously, the flip side of that is that the idea behind the sales tax is that you had the police and the fire and all the things that were needed to help support the actual brick and mortar. Well, I think that argument is that they realize is now kind of not holding all that much water. And the idea of the internet fairness is I think is going to move. And I think you will see that because more and more local communities are seeing the need for it. And we want to make sure that the small guy, the local business, the Ace Hardware, isn't going to be the one that's going to be left out high and dry.
Good, thank you.
That's true interstate commerce, and the federal government was, under the Constitution, can regulate that, unlike some other things. But, I mean, the whole discussion, it seems to me, goes back to the nature of the Constitution and the federal republic. The federal government wants to do more and more and more. Obama has his czars, you don't hear about those anymore. It seems to me, no president, I don't care who he is, can effectively run the federal government, if not now, at some point in the future, because it's so broad. He has to hire so many people, his span of control as a manager. He can't do it. Whereas the founding fathers set it up as a federal republic. Education is supposed to be handled by the states. Divorce and marriage by the states. And any number of other issues. They talk about states' rights, but it's the Constitution says powers. And any powers that aren't given to the federal government are retained by the states. States have no rights, people have rights, but we'll get into that discussion. But it seems to me this is becoming a turning point perhaps in our history, where people need to start reading the Constitution and see what it really is and what it really does. Because it's easy to set up a centralized government. Well, the French did it 200 years ago. The Germans excel in it. And we know what happened with those people. So, but a number of the issues that have been discussed today, if the states, if we didn't have concentration of power in the federal government, I'll bet you dollars to those donuts, non-inflationary dollars, that we'd be better off than we are today.
Comes back to how you started the meeting about talking about Washington having a spending problem, and tied back to education. If the government was not spending so much, it wasn't trying to regulate the states so much, particularly in the area of education, a lot of that money could go back to the states rather than being spent on the federal bureaucracy.
Well,
We would see improvements.
Well, we do see a larger, more expensive federal government. There's no question about it. For those that haven't been to Washington lately, let me just tell you, if you sit out at Capitol Hill and look out, you'll see probably 9 cranes. Things are booming in Washington. Unemployment rate's down low. So the government is growing. And that's, unfortunately, not in the direction we want to see happen. We much prefer to see the private sector grow and thrive than the government grow and thrive. Because the government really doesn't produce much of anything. So we need a government. We need regulations. We want them to be smart regulations and the like. But I do think that we've got to talk about making sure that the government is a smaller, more responsive government as opposed to a larger, more expensive one.
Congressman, we have time for 2 more questions.
2 more questions about that, or statements? Yes?
I can take the conversation
Sure.
to South America.
Sure.
Can you talk a little bit about first war on drugs, including Mexico, but I'm from Colombia, so I have that interest in South America. Now seeing governments are going to the far left, like Venezuela and Ecuador, Bolivia, Paraguay. So what's the conversation, what's the position? It looks there is some economy that are really growing in South America. So I'm interested in free trade agreements, and then you can talk about the war on drugs.
Okay, well, first on the trade, because certainly from Colombia, I'm delighted that we're able to sign that agreement with Colombia, who has been a very good friend and ally to the United States, and that has been an agreement that we've been trying to move forward, I think, for about 6 years. That didn't happen. And so, for instance, when the president came and talked before a joint session of Congress and said, in essence, this is my jobs bill, I want you to pass it, and pass it right now. Everybody see that? You ever watch the president when he talked about that? Or is that, you guys see it at least on the news? As opposed to just missing it out of hand because there weren't enough votes in the democratically controlled Senate for him to pass his jobs plan there. What I did is say, what are the areas of agreement? Where do we agree? What parts of the jobs bill do we actually like, and can we move those forward? Part of that was, excessive regulation on small businesses, but one of it was, let's double exports by 2014. Right, so he wants to talk about, please send me the trade agreements for Colombia, Panama, and South Korea. We agree. Mr. President, we agree. Let's move those forward. So let's take those agreements, and let's move them forward through the House, through the Senate, the President signing into law. So we now have an opportunity to talk about selling American goods and services all over the globe, but certainly more specifically to Colombia, Panama, and South Korea. 95% of our purchasing power is outside of the United States. I'm sorry, 73% of the purchasing power is outside of the United States. 95% of the consumers are outside of the U.S. So if we want to talk about a manufacturer here in the United States that we want to start sending stuff over to South Korea, for instance, if we wanted it for some of our farmers in the country, bushel of corn was several 100% in terms of the tariff going over to South Korea. It goes to 0 overnight. 84% of the goods and services that we would deal with Colombia and South Korea alike go to 0 overnight. 92% over 5 years, 100% over 10. So this is a positive. This is a step forward to enable us to be able to try to create more goods and services here to ship overseas. We want to level the playing field for the American worker, because if we do so, the American workers will. The war on drugs, certainly we know that that's been a long-standing issue. Certainly we've been working very closely with Colombia for a long time on that war on drugs. And that's going to also be coming down to how do we police our border. We recognize this has been a significant issue. President Calderon of Mexico recognized a significant issue, tried to put people along the border from the military side, from Mexican's military side. Certainly we've got to make sure that we're controlling who's coming in to the United States. It's a matter of national security issue, and certainly a big step in the war on drugs.
How about consumption?
How about consumption?
Right, because as a Colombian, I keep exporting because there's a big market and that's profitable. And drugs will always find a way to get here because there's a big demand.
I think, and the thing that's really frightening is that we've seen the expansion of the drug trade significantly. And one of the things that's an enormous concern for me is heroin. We've seen that heroin coming into our schools growing exponentially. Chicago, the Chicago area, in the northern suburbs, Lake County, worked with Sheriff Kern on this. I mean, has seen a huge increase in heroin. The problem with heroin is you choose to use heroin once. Then, the chances of you getting hooked are significant. It's a real problem. Because what we've seen back before, when we talked about heroin being shot through needles into your bloodstream, that was when it was about 3% pure. Today it's up 70–80% pure, okay, which is why people can snort it, why people can smoke it, and it's extraordinarily, I would say, lethal, because we've seen teen deaths rise significantly on this. So how do we curb that? I think part of it is going to be education, how we curb, drug use here, but it's also going to be making sure that we're watching it closely. Obviously, it's a huge concern with regard to gangs, right? When we talk about the drug trade, gangs are an issue in the Round Lake communities, as they are an issue in North Chicago and Waukegan, and are growing coming up from Chicago. So this is an enormous concern because it's the source of finances for a lot of these gangs and for the drug trafficking that's coming in. So how do we stop that? It becomes difficult, especially with a drug that's as powerful and as addicting as heroin, because people will do almost anything to get their next dose once they're hooked. So that's the issue, is going to be education and making sure that we're vigilant and making sure at the schools and night that we don't tolerate it. Okay, Well, listen, I want to thank you all for giving me an opportunity to come and talk with you and just have a dialogue, and I look forward to doing it again. And I know there's a couple that we didn't get a whole lot, didn't hear from, but we'll hear from you guys next time. But please do know, you know, if you need anything, you go pick up the phone, give us a call, go onto the website. You can track us down that way, and if there's issues or concerns that you have, or things that you also would like to talk about, I'd certainly like to hear from you. So, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Good to see you.